Hi, I'm Pam, and I'm here to talk about retro video games. You know I love me some Bloodlines, but today I'm not talking about Vampire the Masquerade. I'm talking about Castlevania. Castlevania Bloodlines was developed by Konami and released on the Sega Genesis in 1994. It's the only Castlevania title that was specifically developed for a Sega console. This game is a platformer where you get to choose between two protagonists, John Morris or Eric Lecard. I bet you can't guess what these two lads are out to do. They're trying to defeat Dracula. Shocker, I know. But before they get to the big bloodsucker himself, they'll need to defeat his niece, Countess Elizabeth Bartley. Is this supposed to be noted serial murderer and virgin bloodbather Elizabeth Bathory? I kinda think so. The game has 6 stages broken into levels that'll take you to a variety of familiar-looking locations like Gothic castles, graveyards, towers, and rooms full of clockwork parts. Destroying candles reveal special items like coats of arms to increase the power and range of your weapon, special weapons, coins, jewels, and the occasional 1-up. Unlike most Castlevanias, your special weapons are powered by jewels instead of hearts, but it works pretty much the same way. And honestly, it makes more sense. The special items available here are an axe, which throws in an arc, a boomerang, which will return to you, and sacred water, which causes damage both at the point of impact and along the ground around it. The special items have their regular use and an even more special use if you use them while pressing up on the D-pad. There's also a mirror item which will clear any enemies from the screen when you touch it. It was hard not to constantly compare this with Super Castlevania 4 as I played it. They're really quite similar games, but there are a few key differences and design decisions that I had to question. The biggest difference is that right from the start, you can choose between 2 characters to play as. John uses the classic vampire killer whip, while Eric has a lance with a longer reach. John can use the whip to latch onto the ceiling and swing between platforms, and Eric can do a high vertical jump to get to out-of-reach platforms and even skip the stairs at times. I played through the entire game as John and then tried out 2 stages as Eric afterwards. It kind of made me regret not choosing him to begin with. He moves slightly faster and feels a little less stiff. I also really appreciated his extra range, and his jump was much more fun to use than the whip swing. Using the whip to grapple felt a little bit awkward, not nearly as smooth as it was in Castlevania 4, and honestly, it wasn't even that important of a move. There were only a handful of times where I really needed to use it. The most questionable control decision is in diagonal attacks. I didn't notice this at first, but when I got to the Bone Dragon boss, I started trying to swing my whip up and to the right at it, and realized I couldn't. I could only do a diagonal whip attack if I was jumping. I couldn't do it on the ground. Eric, on the other hand, can do a diagonal attack from the ground, but not while jumping. This is a really bizarre limitation to put on the controls and an odd way of differentiating between the characters. It makes both movesets feel incomplete, and was a big step down from the 8 directional attacks you could do in 4. However, I have to say, general movement and walking speed feels pretty good. Both characters have less of a lumbering, heavy gait than Simon Belmont does. The controls are responsive, and aside from the things I complained about, it feels really good to play. Staircases have been my biggest complaint in every previous Castlevania game I've played, and here, they aren't terrible. They're actually pretty decent. You don't feel like you're glued to them and can even jump when you're on a staircase. With 6 stages as opposed to Super Castlevania's 9, this is a shorter game, but it's also quite a bit more difficult. The difficulty curve is pretty good. The first level is quite straightforward and fairly easy, but things soon ramp up. I think the biggest difference is that there are very few health pickups, at least that I found. The classic wall meat is there, made obvious by cracks in the walls, but it's not abundant and almost never found just before you get to a boss. Power-ups make a huge difference to the game's difficulty. At full power, John has a flaming whip, which does much more damage than normal. However, if you take any damage, you lose that power. Then there are ultimate weapons like the blue orb, which send magic all throughout the room and can take out even bosses in quick measure. Having a good supply of gems can also make things much easier, especially on bosses. I really liked the boomerang myself, though the axe was great for flying enemies. If you die, you get to continue from the level you're on, but you lose your gems. You get 2 continues in the game, but there's also a password system that will let you continue from the start of each stage. There are some interesting levels in Bloodlines. Stage 2 is a water level. Neither of the protagonists can swim, so you'll have to race against water filling up the screen at times, and at others, travel downwards as water recedes. Stage 4 has conveyor belts, which can help or hinder your movement, along with pistons that you need to use as platforms and avoid being crushed by. Stage 6 is probably the most unique of all. In 6.2, the screen is fractured, which can make jumping between platforms trippy and difficult. Luckily, I had just watched an Erin Plays video where she revealed the secret to this level, otherwise it might have been frustrating. In 6.3, it changes things up again and makes you travel upside down on the ceiling. When it comes to boss fights, the real trick for most of them is figuring out where you need to hit them or how fast you need to hit them, as some will disappear when you get close or not register your attack if it takes too long. My favorite fight of the game was Death, as he combined all my favorite bosses I had already fought. He has a deck of cards, and which one you hit will determine what you'll face next. It could be an attack, a health refill, or a fight. The bosses here do have much less health than the first time you face them, but all of them are fun and require something a little different from you. You need to knock rocks off the golem to expose his weak spot, do a lot of dodging and anticipating attacks from the gargoyle bat, and react to the constantly changing form and weak spot location of the Gearstormer. Bloodlines starts with a great little cinematic to introduce the story, but once the actual gameplay started, my first thought was, wow, this looks bad. Okay, Sega fans, hear me out before you leave. Many things in this game are visually impressive. The sprite work is lovely. John and Eric look great and are well animated. Bosses and enemies are also really well done. I particularly like the Princess of Moss, which turned into a moth with beautiful fluttering wings. The mecha and armored knights, though maybe a bit overused, had excellent designs and attack animations. And the gear boss looked great and moved super fluidly. The color palette is sometimes attractive, like on this sunset level where everything reflects on the water below. But detail is often lacking, especially in the backgrounds. Take stage 2-3 for example. The sky is mostly black with some still objects against it and a plain blue bar at the bottom of the screen. 2.6 similarly lacks details in the skybox and uses fuchsia as a background to olive green. Yuck. Or 4.9, where the sky is just 3 big blocks of different shades of red and are not blended very well at all. The final boss of stage 1 has a background of a plain blue sky. No gradient, no clouds floating by. I am not impressed. It may be a little bit unfortunate for Bloodlines that the last Genesis game I played was Shinobi 3, because every part of that game was gorgeous. Levels are full of tiny little animations, blinking lights, foreground effects. Every screen is filled with movement and depth. Just look at these skies from Shinobi 3 and Gunstar Heroes. While they may use a smaller range of colors, they have gorgeous gradients and use techniques like dithering to really make them pop. The skies in most level of Bloodlines just don't compare. They're flat and static. The visual impact of levels like the swaying, leaning Tower of Pisa, which should have been a standout, are lessened by the hideous background. Even some objects that are front and center, like these large statues, lack decent coloring or detail. I thought it was really cool how you destroyed them to make a path for yourself, but the visual design of this whole segment seems kinda low effort, like John has somehow found himself in an 8-bit game. Indoor levels are generally more interesting to look at, particularly Stage 5's Palace of Versailles, which has a cool light filtering effect and a rotating staircase to make your way up. The Stage 3 boss, Gargoyle Bat, and the final phase of the Dracula fight are really the only outdoor levels that try to be more visually exciting. My thoughts on this game's soundtrack are very similar to my thoughts on Castlevania 4's. The best tracks are still the ones they're reusing from the NES games. The rest of them are fine, nothing I find myself humming after I'm done playing. And the sound effects, especially the ones you're gonna hear the most, they're pretty weak and tinny sounding. Though this review was heavy on the criticism, I actually had a lot of fun playing through Castlevania Bloodlines. The movement and controls were superior to previous games in the series that I've played, even if I questioned some of the attack limitations put on the characters. There are interesting concepts for many of the levels, and I quite enjoyed all of the boss fights. My biggest issue with the game is that, on a visual level at least, it just doesn't quite seem to be on the same level as other games people consider to be best on the Genesis. They could have done a lot more with color and visual effects. But hey, looks aren't everything. If you want to see more, check out my review of Super Castlevania 4 or another of my videos. I have a Patreon if you want to support the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.